Our next speaker is Tyler Golato from Molecule, and he will talk about VitaDao and how to decentralize longevity research.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Yeah, there have been a lot of really interesting scientific presentations today, and I'll be following on actually a little bit in the same direction as the last presentation, talking about new organizational structures and governance structures that exist in, or that are emerging in the drug development space, with a particular focus through a use case called VitaDao, which is a new organization that is focused on the decentralized funding and governance of longevity research. And this is quite interesting because it represents sort of an entirely new way of the public or communities actually forming around causes and becoming directly involved with not only their funding, but how they're regulated, how they're governed, and how therapeutics are ultimately brought to market. And before I dive in, I'll be trying to talk about a few key terms here that I want to create some shared understanding around. We won't go into too much technical depth in the context of this talk today, but VitaDao is a blockchain project in essence. It's a crypto project, if you wanted to call it that, and I think there's a strong need to create a shared understanding of these terms and what they mean, particularly in this context. So decentralization just really speaks about the transfer of control of an organization or an activity from one stakeholder to several. And so if you look at this image on the side here, you could basically see that in a decentralized organization, no one individual or no one party can exert a large degree of control on the organization. And what that creates is a certain strength and resiliency where it becomes quite difficult for, let's say, a bad actor or somebody who wanted to take control to do so. Blockchains are simply decentralized ledgers. They're akin to a decentralized database that create a peer-to-peer network where individuals all over the world can engage in transactions with each other. These are typically used in the context of transacting with a cryptocurrency, which is simply a currency that is used to verify records in the context of these blockchains. And the simplest way to think about this is that we have a decentralized network that is not controlled by any individual. There's no sort of middleman, and in the end, people are able to engage with each other in a peer-to-peer way that is sort of trustless and permissionless. An example of a blockchain, for example, is the Ethereum blockchain, and an example of a cryptocurrency would be Ethereum, for example, or ETH on that blockchain. Building on that, I want to talk a little bit about smart contracts, which form the basis of these new organizations that I'll be discussing today. Smart contracts are basically a self-enforceable digital representation of a traditional contract. And from a super basic level, basically, if you had, let's say, you wanted to create an agreement with somebody to upload, let's say, a data set, you can have a smart contract basically hold money in escrow, and when a certain number of parameters were met, that smart contract would distribute money to the person who fulfilled their end of the contract. So basically, it's just a way to enable individuals to engage in agreements without needing a sort of party to mediate that. And finally, I want to talk about DAOs, which will be at the core of the presentation today. DAOs are decentralized autonomous organizations. In some ways, they're the most complex form of a smart contract, where basically the bylaws of a decentralized organization are embedded directly in a technical code. And what this means is that you can create an organization that has a certain goal. That goal could be, in the case of VitaDao, to fund longevity research. And the rules of this organization essentially become governed by a smart contract, and people interact with that smart contract by voting on proposals, by making proposals, and no one basically has control over this entity. It's a really interesting new framework because it introduces this sort of flat hierarchical system and this democracy that doesn't typically exist in traditional top-down organizations. So with that, I would ask, what is one of the most impactful things that a DAO could do today with $1 million or with $10 million, for example? And my belief is that it would be to create a funding collective that would work on funding and governing longevity research, and that's exactly what VitaDao is. So VitaDao's mission is to extend human health span and lifespan by researching, financing, and commercializing longevity therapeutics in an open, accessible, and democratic manner. Any member of the public can join VitaDao, and members are basically committed to nurturing and developing the intellectual property licenses and data sets that result from the projects that VitaDao supports. And this is particularly interesting because unlike a VC or a pharmaceutical company, instead of having, let's say, a clear profit motive or something like this, the community, in essence, can decide how it wants to see things move forward, how it wants to see things progress. In some cases, the community could decide to open source the projects that it's funding. It could decide to try to commercialize them, let's say, by out-licensing them, but it's not controlled by any one individual, and it essentially becomes really a hive mind of the members that contribute to the organization. In essence, VitaDao is really focused on this, what we call the translational gap. So this area where, let's say, academic funding, things like NIH grants fall somewhat short. You sort of get into, let's say, moving away from basic research, and you start to have something that's looking more like a product or a drug. And typically it becomes quite difficult to get funding until you're quite downstream. So until you're really at this sort of preclinical proof of concept stage where startups become quite relevant, or let's say spin-outs or some sort of VC investment becomes relevant. So VitaDao is really working on funding academics that are in this sort of early translational stage and providing funding for projects that are typically higher risk than most VCs would be interested in. And the goal is really to help academics bridge this valley of death without needing to create a startup company in this early stage. From an ecosystem perspective, there's a few different ways that members can join and interact with VitaDao. So people can contribute funding to the organization, and in exchange they receive tokens that allow them to govern the organization. With those tokens, they can basically make proposals on how the DAO spends the money in its treasury. They could vote on which project should be funded. They could vote on how to commercialize a project, whether something should be out-licensed or, let's say, made open source. Or members can also join by contributing work. So academics, PhDs, postdocs that have expertise in the longevity space can actually join the organization by dedicating their time, working on due diligencing projects, evaluating them, and helping guide the community in its decision-making efforts. Over time, VitaDao basically works to distribute this funding to early stage, let's say early stage drug development efforts in the longevity space, also the development of biomarkers, for example, or new methods. And in exchange for that funding, the laboratories hand over parts of their data and their intellectual property to the DAO, which again is then governed by members in terms of how to advance those therapies and potentially try to bring them to market or out-license them. The DAO holds intellectual property through quite a novel mechanism because it's an on-chain entity. So again, this is not a company. It's not something that has an address or exists within a certain jurisdiction. It's a decentralized entity, and the way that it holds intellectual property is actually by attaching legal licenses, patents, data sets to NFTs and holding them on-chain. The DAO was basically launched by a group of contributors who, over roughly a 6-month period, built the DAO, created the infrastructure, and then launched its token. 10% of those tokens went to an auction mechanism where an open source community basically decided what they were willing to pay for the token. They bid in what's called a batch auction. And a sort of base token price was established where everyone ended up getting in for the exact same price. We raised roughly $7 million. I believe it's about $8 million now. And there were roughly 635 people that participated. And over the next 12 months, we'll be trying to deploy this funding into research projects that are really focused on, let's say, these early stage drug development efforts in the longevity space. And so why crypto and longevity? So a lot of people think about, when they think about the cryptocurrency space, they think about the sort of speculation that occurs or the sort of hype that exists in the NFT space. But what's really interesting is that there's this incredible alignment between some of the core key opinion leaders in crypto and the longevity space. And Balaji, who's the CTO of Coinbase, once said that longevity has the potential to be to traditional medicine what crypto is to traditional finance. It really changes the terms of the debate. And I think what you see happening in the space is that there are a lot of newly minted millionaires, and in some cases billionaires, that are interested in doing something, let's say, more real with their money. They're interested in investing into projects that could make an impact, that can change the direction of humanity. And really, there's this sort of, let's say, a strong overlap between these communities. Both have really been, let's say, dismissed to some extent by incumbents due to their high-risk nature. I think aging research, especially in the past few years, has really become increasingly mainstream. And yeah, I think this year, for example, there's been a huge amount of funding and interest being poured into the space, but this is a relatively new development. And the goal here is really to align the most forward-thinking economically with the most forward-thinking scientifically to create the largest impact. What is unique about this project? Again, it's not a VC, it's not a company, it's an organization that consists of a collection of decentralized contributors around the world that are tied together by this interest in contributing broadly to the longevity space and helping move the needle and advance projects closer to the clinic. Similarly, the sort of, let's say, the incentive system there is really built around this idea that VitaDao over time will grow a portfolio of intellectual property assets that result from its projects. And again, the community can decide if this work is something that should be made open source, if it's something that should be out-licensed, engaged in a co-development deal with, let's say, a pharmaceutical partner. The community has control and governance over how this actually evolves, which is quite unique from an organizational perspective. VitaDao will typically provide funding up to about $250K, and in some cases higher for particularly promising projects. And the goal, again, is to fund early-stage, high-risk, high-reward longevity projects and make decisions in roughly 2 to 3 weeks. But the biggest asset and the most important, I think, element of this project, or why it is really unique, is because of this community. It's a community of researchers, enthusiasts, and even in some cases organizations from around the world that are coming together around this common goal with an interest in funding research. And as an academic, you have the unique opportunity to really engage this community of people. You have the opportunity to work more in the open. And there's basically, as I'll show you in a second, a Discord community that contains, I think, roughly 1,500 people at this point that are interested in learning more about the work that you're doing, supporting you, and trying to help you advance your research closer to the clinic. From a structural perspective, it obviously wouldn't make sense to have anyone off the street doing due diligence around a scientific research project or a drug development project. So what we've done is we've created what are called working groups within the DAO itself. These are basically a series of work streams that consist of domain experts in a variety of areas, such as legal, technical, the actual developers that are developing the software, people working on sort of awareness and education. But the most important is really the longevity working group, which focuses on the due diligence of projects and project evaluation. At the moment, this is, I believe, between 30 and 50 individuals that are PhDs, postdocs, professors at universities all over the world that help do basically evaluate scientific projects that come into the DAO and make recommendations to the broader community about what should be funded and where this sort of community's effort should be dedicated. At the end of the day, these groups don't have any executive power, but they serve the broader token holder community and help them make decisions around what might be in VitaDao's interest in the long term to fund. Again, there's also service providers, so these are companies that maybe provide legal services to the DAO or contract research organizations that can serve the DAO. And the DAO can work sort of in the context of, let's say, engaging other projects in the DAO and crypto ecosystem, but can also engage in sort of real-world interactions with real-world legal entities and other organizations, for example. The way that we work is I think, really interesting. The DAO itself is organized into a series of sort of different tiers of, let's say, work streams. The first is Discord, which is almost like this place for ideation and conversations to happen. As I mentioned before, there's roughly 1,500 people that are part of this community. It's not very different from a Reddit community in some senses. You have a series of channels and a series of topics that anyone could come into and make recommendations or speak about an interesting paper that came out. And then there's also the actual working group streams where these individual working groups collaborate and speak. And this Discord is completely open. You could join this today if you wanted to, and you could peek into even the working groups, for example, and see how the DAO is working on a day-to-day basis. Beyond this, this is quite, let's say, it's a bit chaotic. It's very stream of consciousness. The next sort of tier is Discourse, which is actually sort of a soft governance platform. This is where the initial proposals for the DAO are sort of formed. Anyone could come in here who's a member of the DAO and make a recommendation. They could say that, I think we should hire a full-time technical lead, for example, or I think, we should fund this project out of so-and-so's laboratory at X university. And basically, people from the DAO begin to have a conversation here. So there's sort of a process that happens where, over time, people begin to come to some form of community consensus around whether or not a project is interesting to fund. And after about a 10-day period of discussing and debating, typically with the advice of the working groups, these are actually moved on-chain for an actual token-based vote where all the members will say, yes, we are interested in funding this project, or no, we're not. We're extremely grateful to have the opportunity to fund work in Morton's laboratory, which was the first project that actually passed, with roughly just over 2 million votes, which I believe represents roughly 20% of the token holder community having voted. And this was a really special moment. This is the first time that a research project has been funded by a decentralized organization. And it's I think a really exciting moment, not only for the longevity space, but also for sort of the Web3 and blockchain space in general. Going a bit further into how the DAO actually holds IP, we use something called an IPNFT, which is a framework that Molecule created. It's a mechanism that basically allows legal contracts, so a sponsored research agreement or a contract research agreement or a patent or any sort of legal document to be attached to an NFT, which you might know from sort of the art space, for example, or some of the music space. But these NFTs are actually really interesting because they allow you to take a real-world asset and basically move it on-chain where it can be held by a DAO. And so this provides an entirely new fundraising mechanism for early-stage research, where now, as a researcher, you could basically come, define some specifications around your project, maybe define a licensing agreement working with your TTO, and basically mint these IP NFTs that organizations like VitaDao can come and purchase and basically provide funding for your work. So how can you get involved? If you're interested, please join the Discord community. The community is open for anyone to join. If you're an academic, if you have domain expertise, you can join the working groups and share your expertise. You'll be compensated for your help. So the whole point of this is to really create an incentive system that strongly aligns all of the members that are helping out in the DAO. If you're a researcher, we're really interested in, we have funding to deploy, and we want to fund academics who are sort of working at that, let's say, preclinical stage in terms of drug development, or if you're developing biomarkers, for example. We are funding projects up to about 250K. And we would be happy to speak to you about your project and learn a bit more about it. There's also a number of, I just want to touch briefly on some of the challenges. So DAOs are really interesting because they're decentralized and because the efforts are broadly distributed, but they also pose, because of that very reason, a number of challenges. There are some things that you don't need 1,000 people to come to consensus on to do, for example. And so over time, the DAO spends a lot of effort basically trying to create a structure, operational practices from scratch through the sort of consensus of all of its members. And so it's really an iterative process that takes months to basically establish the ways that it works, whether it's continuing to do, let's say, soft governance on Discourse, or creating a new channel structure for Discord, or deciding how the treasury is managed. All these things happen based on the efforts of these decentralized open source contributors, and so it doesn't have necessarily the sort of agility in the early stages of, let's say, a startup where you have a very clear management structure. But the trade-off here is really that, although you might not have that efficiency, you have thousands of people that are able to have a voice and some say over what work is funded, how it's developed, and work more closely with researchers to create what I think is a really special sort of experiment that's focused on actually enabling this broad enthusiast community that exists in the aging space to have, a sense of ownership and a sense of participation, which I think for a long time was not really accessible. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Tyler. We have a question here in the audience.
Could you elaborate just a bit on the smart contracts? With contracts there are always, not always, but often disagreements, and I don't know what the mechanism is. Do you hire outside legal assistance? And if so, who do these legal people represent?
Yeah, so in the case of the DAO, the smart contract is basically something that enables the DAO to pass proposals. So there's a primary contract, which, again, there's not necessarily a lawyer mediating this when we're talking about voting in the DAO. What would basically be, the process would look something like an agreement is set up with the university. There's lawyers involved in that process directly, let's say. A licensing agreement is created. And then $250,000 from the DAO treasury is moved into the holding of an escrow contract. And basically, when members decide, collectively, they vote that yes, this project should be funded. It's technology that ultimately is mediating that money is sent to them. It's basically, the smart contract in this case is basically a way for the community to use technology to engage in a vote without someone having to actually coordinate that process. It's mediated by a smart contract in this case.
Does each member of the community have an equal vote?
They don't, no. So it depends on their contribution. So people who contribute, for example, if as a researcher I come in and I put in 30 hours a week, I will have more voting power than somebody who's putting in 5 hours a week. And it's the same with funding. The distribution at the moment is fairly equal. It's not, you don't have these super huge holders and then super small holders, but there is, depending on the effort and the funding that you've put in, you do have a larger or smaller say to some extent.
Interesting idea.
Yeah, thanks.
Maybe we have time for one more question in the audience.
Thank you. So that's very complicated. I have to get my head around it.
Yeah.
The 1,500 folks that have invested, they're basically, you're making them fulfill the requirements of a crowd, as in a crowd wisdom approach.
This is the idea.
Correct?
Yes.
So they are distributed and they're diverse and they're independent, but are they smart enough to do this?
Well, I mean, so this is a really good point, and this is also why the token holder community is advised by a community of domain experts. So within, as I mentioned, we have working groups within the DAO. We have a legal working stream that is just lawyers from around the world. We have a longevity working group stream that is just PhDs and postdocs and professors. And so the goal is to enable the community to have autonomy in its decision making, meaning that at the end of the day, the longevity working group can't come and say, you have to fund this project. But what you find is that people do typically listen to experts. So if the longevity working group comes and says, we've evaluated this project, these are our findings, we believe that this would be valuable for VitaDao to fund, what you will typically find is that the community follows that advice. You're entirely right in thinking, I suppose democracy is maybe not perfect, but it's sort of the best thing that we have, right? And so, I mean, for me, what's interesting about this project specifically is just this idea that you're empowering a large community to have participation in something that they're interested. There's always going to be some tension there. There's always going to be some conflict. But it represents really a new way to allow this large enthusiast community that exists in the aging space to really feel like they have a voice or ownership, and also to have some interaction with researchers directly. And we think that this is quite interesting compared to, let's say, I mean, obviously VCs have a tremendous amount of of value in the biotech ecosystem. But as a researcher, it's probably a different thing to work with a community of, let's say, aging enthusiasts as opposed to working with a VC. It's just a different experience. And so in the end, like VitaDao itself is an experiment, right? I can't say with any confidence that in 2 years' time, pharmaceutical companies won't exist and everything will be done through a DAO. But what I can say is that it'll be, I think, an experiment worth doing, and we'll have a lot of insights into how decentralized communities work, what they're good at, what they're not good at, and that's sort of the point of doing it.
Okay, great.
Thanks so much.
There are more questions on Slack, so it would be great if you
awesome.
can